Hello, and thank you for listening to our online event. So, my name is Elizabeth Raphael. I am an undergraduate here at Johns Hopkins University. I'm in my final year. I study international relations, art history, and French, and I first became involved with Homewood Museum through a course taught by former director Julie Rose, where I was working on the Enslaved at Homewood exhibit. Just to give you a brief outline of today's presentation, I will begin with a bit about myself and how I became involved with research into the artist Chester Harding and Homewood Museum. Then I will discuss the concept of the itinerant artist and how that fits into larger themes in 19th century American history. I will then move through the life and career of Harding, laying out his beginnings and mapping his movements. Finally, I will contextualize Harding's career within the context of 19th century Baltimore and offer some conclusions about the significance of this research for Baltimore, for itinerant portraiture, and for social mobility. So I will just start with a brief introduction and tell you a bit about how I first became involved with my research at Homewood Museum. So here you can see two portraits. You can see two portraits of Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the signer of the Declaration of Independence. On the left, you can see Homewood's version of the portrait, and on the right, you can see an authenticated Chester Harding version of Charles Carroll of Carrollton. And this version hangs at the National Portrait Gallery. So the reason for this comparison will make more sense just momentarily. In 2018, I began working on an investigative research project into the provenance of a portrait of Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the signer, which was acquired by Homewood Museum in 2014. Though we cannot view the portrait in person, obviously, I will provide this photograph of the work on the left. Any of you who may have visited Homewood Museum in person prior to the pandemic, you are probably familiar with this portrait. So this work was actually donated in semi-mysterious circumstances with little known information into the authorship and the provenance of the work. So on December 18th, 2014, Mr. Scott Appel donated a portrait of Charles Carroll of Carrollton in memory of his mother, Laudine Stefanowicz Appel, to Homewood Museum. Due to significant damage and the need for extensive repair, you can actually see it here because this is before it had been fixed up. The work was not put on display for several years at Homewood. It remained untouched and away from the public eye until around 2017. So this portrait is of particular interest because it is so similar to two other portraits of Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the signer, obviously so named because he signs the Declaration of Independence. So the two portraits that our Homewood version so closely resembles are authenticated works by an American portrait painter by the name of Chester Harding, and he is in fact the artist who will serve as the main focus of my presentation today. So Harding painted many leaders from the 19th century. Just to give a brief and impressive list of why his potential authorship of our painting is so significant, Harding painted men such as the signer, of course, along with James Madison, General William Sherman, Davy Crockett, and of particular interest to me and this presentation, Daniel Boone. So the two authenticated works by Harding hang in the United States Capitol Building and the National Portrait Gallery, and ours hangs in Homewood Museum. So after extensive art historical, archival, and conservation research, I do have strong reason to believe that this portrait could be an original work by Chester Harding, though to be totally transparent, there is really no way to verify this information with 100% certainty. We would need to uncover a signature of the artist on the portrait. So while I would love to walk you through each and every piece of my evidence and firmly convince all of you that our Homewood portrait is likely an original Chester Harding, my research paper is about 30 pages long and I only have a limited amount of time here. But that being said, I would like to offer a few pieces of evidence for the sake of credibility that strongly strengthen the argument in favor of Chester Harding's authorship of our Homewood portrait. So first, we do know for sure that Chester Harding painted Charles Carroll of Carrollton in 1828, both due to the authenticated portraits that do exist, but also thanks to the advertisements and reviews for the display of Harding's works at the Athenaeum. So Chester Harding was a prolific artist also. He painted many versions of a single portrait and would even go so far as to redo his works should fashion change, should more detail be needed, or even when he believed that his ability had significantly improved. It is therefore not improbable to say that a few stray or unidentified Harding's works may exist without knowledge, and this argument has actually been applied to other areas. From a scientific or conservational standpoint, the museum had a full conservation report conducted on the work by actually Heather Smith, who is also speaking today. And the report revealed that a few important pieces of information that really strengthen the argument in favor of Harding's authorship. So the Homewood Museum portrait was indeed painted circa 1828, at the same time as the works that are located in the National Portrait Gallery and on Capitol Hill. And we do know this due to a stamp on the back of the work's original canvas backing that places the purchase of this canvas with a British canvas seller that was very popular among American artists in the 1820s by the name of Thomas Brown. Lastly, from the personal testimony of the Apel family, who were the donors of the work, in an email exchange with Scott Apel, the son of Laudine Apel, who donated the work in her name, we were able to gather enough information to trace Miss Apel's roots to the McTavish family, which was a branch of the original Carroll family. So from here, I was able to construct a timeline that follows the provenance of a Charles Carroll of Carroll portrait that directly flowed from Charles Carroll of Carrollton, was gifted to his granddaughter, Emily McTavish, and remained within the McTavish line right through to Mrs. Apel. So let me note that I do have much more substantive evidence and archival records that have gone into this research, so you don't have to take my word for this now, but I wanted to give a brief introduction into some of that research. So the main topic that I will be presenting for this presentation is not the provenance of the Homewood portrait, however, but rather the life and career of Chester Harding and its significance for Baltimore as a major destination for itinerant portrait painters. Chester Harding was a prolific American portrait painter who painted a number of influential men in the US and England during his career from approximately 1818 through the 1860s. So before jumping into my research, I just wanted to give you a better understanding of his visual style and some of the subject matter of his works. So right off the bat, I wanted to present you with this selection of some of his works in a mini virtual gallery. So this is using images that I've collected over the course of the past few months, and I will get to discuss a number of these images throughout the presentation. So Harding's style was known to be very true to life, at times even brutally honest for a portrait painter. Harding was not prone to flattery and would depict his subjects just as they appeared before him, having a knack for capturing a particular likeness. As he developed in his career, Harding was particularly cognizant of the ability to learn from his peers. So after his stay in England, for example, he adopted a much more painterly, what one may call free-handed style, while he was copying Sir Thomas Lawrence. Later in his life, it's clear that the crisper style of his contemporaries and the French neoclassic influence from those like Rembrandt Peale would grow more important to the artist. So Chester Harding is classified as what we call an itinerant artist. The itinerant American portrait painter was usually an artist who roamed the country in search of commissions. During the period from 1750 through the 1840s, artists often traveled from one major city or town to another, looking for clients to patronize their artistic services. For the most part, these artists were educated through an apprenticeship system that offered them a formal artistic training, and given the nature of colonial America, many of these artists simply traveled up and down the East Coast to cater wealthy Americans. So Chester Harding did take this path as well. He did move from Boston to New York to Baltimore to D.C., but he also began his career by traveling west to frontier towns like Kentucky, Missouri, and Ohio. Itinerant portraiture was an art form more closely aligned with craftsmanship at the time, so such as sign painting or house painting, and thus it was thought to be less important or impressive than historical painting. Men like Gilbert Stuart, Thomas Sully, and Rembrandt Peale and Chester Harding began to challenge this idea with skillful portraiture and success in the itinerant profession. At a time when America was still a very young country and was the land of opportunity, the role of the itinerant artist was very important for understanding notions of westward expansion and social mobility. Chester Harding, as you will see, has a particularly American story of growing up poor and ultimately becoming one of the most successful artists of his age. Harding earned his reputation as a backwoods artist due to his total lack of formal artistic training and his expansion west to find portrait subjects, breaking the mold of the itinerant peers at the time. In my own research, having read the extensive biography, My Estiography, of Harding, I can't help but also classify him as a backwoods outsider given his very spunky and outgoing personality. So I should also mention here that unlike other itinerant artists of the time, Harding did not tend to advertise himself in newspapers before coming to a town or city. He instead more commonly appeared in reviews of his work afterwards, so it is more useful to rely upon information from his biography, entitled My Osteography again, and to follow the location of his most famous works rather than using newspaper records in order to track his movements. So as such, I will, throughout the presentation, let Harding speak for himself, so to speak, through memorable quotes and passages, and this will give a better idea of his personality, of his inner thoughts, but it will also provide some evidence, some concrete evidence into where his movements were. So beginning with Harding's early life, Harding was born in 1792 in western Massachusetts to a large family that was actually quite poor. In his early life, Harding spent much of his time outdoors, fishing and hunting, which he reflects upon quite fondly in his biography, and in fact may have added to his perception as a, quote, backwoods artist. When the Harding family moved upstate to New York in the beginning of the 19th century, Harding worked for a living as a child, earning his keep doing odd jobs such as clearing land, serving as a drummer boy in the War of 1812, and whatever else kind of work that he could find. In his adult life, Harding briefly attempted to become a pub owner, which actually landed him into debt and put him on the path to becoming a sign and house painter in Pittsburgh in an attempt to pay off his debtors. So there, Harding would paint his first ever portrait of his beloved wife and find his passion for portrait painting. Harding describes this time in his life in his autobiography, and I will read some quotes from the work below. So, he says, "About this time, I fell in love with a portrait painter by the name of Nelson, one of the primitive sort. He was a sign, ornamental, and portrait painter. He had for a sign a copy of the Infant Artist of Sir Joshua Reynolds with this inscription, sign, ornamental, and portrait painting executed on the shortest notice." So from this passage, you can see that portraiture was kind of grouped in with these other more decorative arts such as sign and ornamental paintings. Harding says, "I saw his portrait and was enamored at once. I got him to paint me and my wife and thought the picture's perfection. At length my admiration began to yield an ambition to do the same thing. I thought of it by day and dreamed of it by night until I was stimulated to make an attempt at painting myself. I got a board, and with such colors as I had for use in my trade, I began a portrait of my wife. I made a thing that looked like her. The moment I saw the likeness, I became frantic with delight. It was like the discovery of a new sense. I could think of nothing else." So in this portion of the presentation, I will follow Chester Harding through his travels, employing once again evidence from his autobiography and incorporating images of works that he is known to have completed in each of these locations as best as I am able to. So looking at his early artistic career, Harding first moved to Paris, Kentucky in 1817, where it was believed that artists were making, quote, as much as $50 per head, and this was really where he began his career as a professional artist. It is worth noting again here that the portrait scene in the Midwestern United States was really not as mainstream and established as the itinerant portrait career along the East Coast, where it was much easier to find distinguished individuals to portray because American power was so concentrated here at the time. Harding found popularity and was charging about $25 per portrait, a nice price. And I have included one work here from this time period, and this is a portrait of the prominent John Speed family, after which the Speed Art Museum is actually named. So from here, Harding gains enough success to travel to Philadelphia, and in Philadelphia, he views the works of more prominent artists such as Thomas Sully. For the first time in his portrait painting career, Harding becomes aware that his work does not exactly measure up to the other, quote, great artists of his time. He says, "I would sometimes feel a good deal discouraged as I looked at the work of older artists. I saw the labor it would cost me to emulate them. One good effect of my visit to Philadelphia was to open my eyes to the merits of the work of other artists, though it took away much of my self-satisfaction." And I will actually return to this point momentarily, as Harding's penchant for comparison and self-improvement becomes increasingly important to him in his later career, and especially when he travels overseas, you can see this. So, in terms of our story, after moving from Cincinnati to St. Louis to Boston without much luck in itinerant portrait painting, Harding ends up returning to Kentucky and then going to Missouri. So in 1820, in Missouri, Harding's career really reached a turning point that would truly establish him as a reputable portrait painter. It was here that Harding set out to paint the distinguished American frontiersman Daniel Boone. It seems very appropriate that a backwoods portrait painter such as Chester Harding would gain a commission to paint the famous frontiersman. And his portrait, Daniel Boone's portrait, had not been so common due to the relative scarcity of itinerant portrait painters out west. So, in a very Harding manner, the artist sought out the frontiersman himself. Boone actually did not request for him to paint his picture, so Harding sought out the frontiersman himself in an effort to improve his own standing as a painter. Harding says of the trip, "In June of this year, I made a trip of 100 miles for the purpose of painting the portrait of old Colonel Daniel Boone. I had much trouble in finding him. I at once told him the object of my visit. I explained the matter to him, and he agreed to sit. He was 90 years old and rather infirm. His memory of passing events was much impaired, yet he would amuse me every day by his anecdotes of earlier life." So here I will just include one of these anecdotes of earlier life because I think it's rather entertaining. So Harding recounts this story. "I asked him one day, just after his description of one of his long hunts, if he ever got lost having no compass. 'No,' said he, 'I can't say as ever I was lost, but I was bewildered once for 3 days.'" Indeed, this portrait of Daniel Boone would become one of Harding's most famous works and lend him the credibility and reputation to paint other grand figures in American society and history throughout this time period. It is a really interesting case in social mobility. Chester Harding is able to capitalize upon the status of Daniel Boone of another man in order to improve his own status in the field of portraiture. So this is an important theme that recurs in the life of Chester Harding, especially in the context of Baltimore and the Washington area, where Harding would ultimately find ample opportunities to depict the works of well-known and highly established individuals in the United States. So here's a small map showing just some of the locations that Harding visited throughout his travels. He often went back and forth throughout these locations during his career. So during Harding's early career, we know from his biography that he spent the year in Washington, D.C. from 1821 through 1822. He says, "During my stay in Washington, I painted many of the distinguished men of the day, such as Mr. Adams, Mr. Wirt, and all the judges of the Supreme Court and Co. Among them was a full-length portrait of Judge Marshall for the Athenaeum. I consider it a good picture." So Boston was really the first city where Harding had major success, and I will let Harding speak for himself about his experience here. And here's a portrait there also. So Boston was the city where he had major success. He says, "For 6 months I rode triumphantly on the wave of fortune. I took a large room, arranged my pictures, and fixed upon 1 o'clock as my hour for exhibition. As soon as the clock struck, my bell would begin to ring, and people would flock in, sometimes to the number of 50. New orders were constantly given me for pictures. I was compelled to resort to a book for registering the names of numerous applicants. As a vacancy occurred, I had only to notify the next on the list, and it was filled. I do not think that any artist in the country ever enjoyed more popularity than I did, but popularity is often easily won and as easily lost. Mr. Stuart, the greatest portrait painter this country ever produced," he's speaking of Gilbert Stuart here, "was at that time in manhood strength as a painter, yet he was idle half the winter. He would ask his friends, 'How rages the Harding fever?'" So, by the summer of 1823, Harding had garnered enough wealth and success to gain formal training in portrait painting, and so he traveled abroad to England. Through a series of letters written to his daughters and personal journals that he kept in the time, Harding provides a really rich description of his time in England. And through his words, we can see once again his sense of true insecurity and a feeling of being out of place, not only within British society, but also within the art scene there. And this really further characterizes Harding as an outsider of sorts. When comparing himself to Sir Thomas Lawrence, an established artist of the time, Harding calls himself a beginner and notes some differences in the criticism between the two men. Instead of overlooking the faults, they are most apt to overlook any little merit the picture may possess, and seem to take great credit to themselves for having discovered that the pictures are not perfect, but happily for the artist, and perhaps for the art, the beginner is content with a smaller share of approbation, as he is also content with a smaller share for his first efforts. A young painter needs the criticism of the wise that he may be confirmed in what is good in his work, and not merely be made to feel that his work is bad. When his work is shown in an exhibition, Harding shares a similar sentiment with his journal. The greatest advantage I shall derive from this exhibition is comparing myself with others. It was sickening, on going into the room, to see some of my pictures so badly placed, but on a little reflection, I thought I was placed as well as I deserve. In fact, Harding seems to be quite self-aware of his claim to fame as an itinerant portrait painter and someone from the backwoods, and worries that his newfound training in England will render him obsolete or at least demand far higher expectations from the artist in the eyes of his clients. He says, "The fact of a man's coming from the backwoods of America, entirely uneducated, to paint even a tolerable portrait was enough to excite some little interest. That source of interest will be cut off on my return. I shall be judged as having had all of the advantages of the best schools of art in Europe, and the probability is that more will be expected of me than is in the power of almost any man to perform." So, as the focus of this presentation is 19th century Baltimore artists, what is the significance of an itinerant artist like Chester Harding for Baltimore? So, despite the artist not being based out of Baltimore, it's very clear that Harding's visits to Baltimore and the Washington area helped him to greatly enhance his reputation. As was the case with Daniel Boone, Harding recognized the elevated status that could be conferred to him through powerful individuals and the opportunity for not only artistic success by painting these individuals, but also that he could gain a sense of upward social mobility. So, first in Washington for the summer of 1820 through 21, as I already discussed, before he had gone to England, and while he was somewhat still an outsider, Harding's portrait of then Massachusetts Senator E.H. Mills proved to be very important for his career, as the senator would encourage Harding to paint in Boston, which would also ultimately become his base. So, in 1830, Harding and his family actually settled in Springfield, Massachusetts, in Western Mass, but he maintained a studio in Boston, located at the 22 School Street in Boston. So he also continued traveling for work, and he painted in Albany, New York, Baltimore, Cincinnati, New Orleans, Richmond, St. Louis, and Washington, D.C. Returning to Baltimore and Washington intermittently through 1828 to 1831, Harding painted the portraits of many influential men from the era, such as Supreme Court Justice John Marshall, James Madison, John Randolph, John Calhoun, the former Vice President of the United States, Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story, Associate Supreme Court Justice Bushrod Washington, Judge Edward Hutchinson Robbins, and of course R. Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the signer. And you can see all of these portraits right here on this slide. So Harding was exposed to the powerful men of Baltimore and Washington society, many of which remain important historical figures for us today. The role of the itinerant artist once again allows Harding to slip through the cracks and really integrate himself into high society by means of his work. Harding tells one anecdote in which he played a game with Supreme Court Justice John Marshall in Richmond, Virginia. So here is Supreme Court Justice John Marshall, and I will just read this funny quote from Chester Harding. So, John Marshall walked directly up to a large bowl of mint julep which had been prepared, and drank off a tumbler full of the liquid, smacked his lips, and then turned to the company with a cheerful, "How are you, gentlemen?" The game began with great animation, and before long I saw the great Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States down on his knees, measuring the contested distance with a straw with as much earnestness as if it had been a point of law. So, as you can see from this quote, Harding, a poor backwoods painter who once described feeling so out of place in British high society and in the art world, was able to truly ingratiate himself and get to know these highly influential men, and even be able to see them in a really casual setting, maybe even a silly setting. So, to contextualize Harding in the context of the Baltimore artists of the time, in particular, it's helpful to look at some of his peers, so itinerant artists and Baltimore-based artists alike. So Rembrandt Peale was another American artist and a prolific portrait painter, and he too was influenced by artistic style after spending time abroad. He painted both Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and founded the Peale Museum in Baltimore. He was interested in progressing his own profession, much like Harding, but also in advancing the profession. So you can kind of see in his self-portrait here a crisper style of sorts, with a bit more French and neoclassical influence. To the right of him is Thomas Sully, and he was another American artist. He also stopped in Baltimore to paint some very influential men, and you can see his style is a bit more painterly, a bit more romanticized and fluid, and you can kind of see that he spent time in England rather than France, and picked this up in Chester Harding style as well. And then finally, all the way to the right, we have Gilbert Stuart, and he was a bit older than the other two men, but he was a very influential itinerant portrait painter who is really credited with having advanced the itinerant portrait profession, and he was also the man behind a very famous portrait of George Washington at the time. So in a scholarly work that discusses Rembrandt Peale, it kind of embodies the social mobility of itinerant artists at the time and what these artists were really aiming for in terms of their aspirations of social mobility, their aspirations for advancing the field of portraiture. So I will just read this. Rembrandt had shared with many of his members of his own generation high hopes for an artistic career. These artists believed they could help teach and refine Americans. The ideal of the artist role was certainly alive and educated in America, but steady support for artists was not. In reality, artists were a diverse group. In Peale's generation, as in many other generations, artists divided into the idealists who worked hard at raising the level of art, but who ultimately had to scramble to maintain themselves, and that steady, less technically and ideologically schooled group of painters who, with a more limited agenda for cultural success, merely painted the best they could and achieved fine, though often unimaginative, results. So that's just a bit about Peale's thoughts on social mobility. So after a brief return to Europe in the mid-1840s after losing his wife, who was the love of his life, Chester Harding lived out his final days in Massachusetts on Cape Cod. He died in April 1866, and his last known portrait was that of General William Sherman, a Union Army general. And I will include two concluding quotes from Chester Harding and his daughter, respectively. So first from Chester Harding: "I am now painting General Sherman, the real hero of the great war that has ended. It is a pleasure to have such a man before men, where I can tell him to turn up this way or that and to come at my bidding." And this next quote is from his daughter: "After his return to Springfield, he occupied himself with putting the last touches to his picture of Sherman. Had he known it was to be the last work of his hands, he could not have labored on it with more care or looked upon it with more affection. The pleasure and interest with which he used to pursue his work in his younger days seemed to have been aroused once more, and as if to vindicate the undying nature of those qualities of mind and heart which constitute the artist." So within these two quotes, you can really see two important phenomena, two themes in Harding's life. First, his own delight and understanding of the stature of the men that he is able to paint. And next, his true love for painting, which is conveyed by his daughter's quote. So to conclude, to make some connections between itinerant portraiture, social mobility, Baltimore, and of course, Chester Harding. For Harding, itinerant portraiture became not only a passion, not only a career, but a means of true upward social mobility. He was a poor boy from western Massachusetts, but able to travel overseas multiple times, provide for his family, and meet some of the most highly regarded men of his era. Harding offers some interesting insight into the concept of westward expansion, class mobility, and the role that Baltimore played as a hub of art and culture during the 19th century. So though I originally began this research in search of an answer to the authorship of the Homewood Museum portrait, it soon became clear that there are far greater implications for Baltimorean and American history through the story of this one really interesting individual. So thank you so much for listening, and a special thanks to Michelle Fitzgerald and Julie Rose for overseeing all of the work that I've done with Homewood. It's been a really great place to work for the past 2 years, and I could not have done all of this research without your wonderful guidance. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation, and I look forward to connecting with you all virtually for the question and answer section. Thank you.